Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Dan Barker. I am co-president with Laurie Gaylor of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly talk show for the rest of us, atheists, agnostics, non-believers, and others who do believe in the constitutional principle of separation between government and religion. We invite you to join us today to become a member, or you can simply ask for a sample issue of our newspaper, Freethought Today, at ffrf.org. Is there a God? Can we be moral without God? How can there be meaning or purpose without God? How should we live? These are philosophical questions that our guest today has addressed. A.C. Grayling is a preeminent British philosopher. He's the author of about 30 books. In 2011, he founded New College of the Humanities in London. Before that, he's been a professor. He was a professor of philosophy at Birkbeck University of London. He's also taught at St. Anne's College in Oxford. Professor Grayling's many books include What is Good? The Search for the Best Way to Live, The Meaning of Things, The Good Book, The God Argument, and The History of Philosophy, 3 Millennia of Thought from the West and beyond. Grayling is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the Royal Society of Arts, an outspoken public atheist. He's vice president of Humanists UK and an honorary associate of the National Secular Society. He frequently appears in British media discussing philosophy and public affairs. This year, Professor A.C. Grayling was on British television to talk about what can philosophy teach us about the global pandemic. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Grayling.
It's a real pleasure, Dan. It's still great to see you.
And I love your books. I've read many of them and followed your career. You've been a philosopher. You've been interested in philosophy since you were a teenager, isn't that right?
Yes. Well, I first fell in love with it when I was 12 years old. I had the very good fortune to read one of the very early and therefore one of the very simple dialogues of Plato called the Humanities. And I thought to myself, golly, if this is what these great iconic figures of our civilization, Socrates and Plato and others, had devoted themselves to, then I think I'm going to try to follow suit. And it's been a wonderful pleasure ever since.
And it's a pleasure following your work as well ever since. Were you raised religious?
No, I had the very good fortune indeed, really, to be born into a family which didn't care about religion. So my first encounter with it was at school. And of course, at school, there were Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and all sorts of people. And it just seemed to me, no different really from the different candies that you have in the candy store. And since they believed different things and spoke about their faiths in different ways, it just occurred to me that there wasn't anything very serious about it. But I can tell you one thing, though, which is that when I got to my big school, my high school, which was a boarding school, and at this boarding school, we had to go to chapel every morning for 10 minutes. And none of us took any notice at all of what happened in chapel because we were busy trying to finish our assignments for class. But one day we had a new chaplain. And this was an Anglican church, an Episcopalian church school. And he read a very familiar prayer in a rather unusual way. So the prayer goes something like this: O Lord, open thou our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may truly love thee and worthily magnify thy holy name. But the way he said it was, he said, "Oh, Lord," well, firstly, he said it in a very revivalist way. He said, "Oh, Lord," like that, it made us all sit up and wonder what was going on. Then he said, "Open thou our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit." And I thought, gosh, that's jolly interesting, the breathing in. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, this Christianity business, I said, give me something to read. I'd be interested to find out a bit more about it. So he gave me a whole big reading list, which included the Epistle to the Romans, which he said was the great converting epistle of Christianity, a book called Honest to God by Bishop Robinson, which in effect said, be a nice Christian, you don't really have to believe in it. And Dostoevsky, The Notes from Underground, lots of different things. And over the course of a school holiday, I read them all. And when I finished, I went back to the school, beginning next term, I went to see him. I said, I've read everything you've asked me to read. After all, I was rather an earnest, studious youth. And I said to him, I've got a question to ask you. And he said, what is it? I said, how can you believe all this stuff? I was really so astonished. I said to him, look, here's the story. God makes a mortal maiden pregnant, and she gives birth to this egregious character, does all sorts of things, including going to the underworld, coming back again. I said, I've heard this story dozens of times. Greek mythology is full of it. Zeus, lucky chap, was always making mortal maidens pregnant, and they were giving birth to heroes like Hercules who went to the underworld and so on. Why is this story any different or better? And you know what? He couldn't answer that question, and I've never met anybody who can.
Well, so you say it's like a candy store. Some of those candies are kind of sour, I would think. So
some are toxic.
So besides being raised in a non-believing family, you basically did put some thought into your belief or lack of belief. But a big question people want to ask, well, if you don't believe in a God, then how can you be moral without that external rule and the threat of punishment or the promise of reward? How can you be a good moral person?
The first thing to mention, of course, is that if you're moral because you're afraid of being punished or because you want a reward, that's not a very good reason for being moral. The really good reason for being moral is the fact that you care about and you have concern for your fellows, for other creatures, for the environment, for our world, for our societies. And the way that we find what it's good to do and how to behave towards our fellows and to our world is by looking, being attentive, being careful, being sympathetic and generous in our attitudes to other people. In fact, the kind of ethical outlook I have, which is a humanistic outlook, is predicated on the idea that the most sympathetic and generous attitude towards our fellows and to our world in general is always the best way to start. And if you can join that with the fact that we ourselves have the responsibility to act well, and we have the responsibility to create meaning in our lives, to create significance, to do things that are worthwhile, then we see that the whole adventure of being a thoughtful, moral, good neighbor to our friends and fellows in society is intrinsically worthwhile, much richer, much deeper than taking some pizza out of the freezer, warming it up, the pizza in question being somebody else's idea of what a good life is.
Wow, well, as a former preacher, I can say amen, or a women or a persons, whatever we want to call that. So you were born and raised in Africa. Was it Rhodesia, I think, at the time? And some people would ask, I know you don't have to go into much detail here, but I know your family had a horrible tragedy and adversity dealing with the death of your sister. If you don't have a belief in a God and something up there, people always say, if it wasn't for God or Jesus, I wouldn't have made it through this horrible time. How do you, as a non-believer, handle tough adversity in your life?
Well, in the case of the tragedies that happened in our family, and I should mention first, by the way, that my parents, of course, are British, both English, but my father was working abroad in Africa in what was then called Northern Rhodesia, now called Zambia. What people think of as Rhodesia is a country which is now called Zimbabwe. There were two separate Rhodesias. And we were out there as sort of expats, really, my father living and working abroad. And just at the time that he retired, this awful thing happened in our family, which was that my sister had married somebody, and just a few months into the marriage, they'd gone to live in South Africa, near Johannesburg. And he reported her missing, and there was a tremendous search for her. Eventually, her body was found in a river, and she'd been stabbed to death. And her husband was arrested and put on trial, but he was acquitted because the evidence was only circumstantial. And I've never been able to get my head round thinking about who did it, partly because of the sort of awful tragedy for my sister herself, but also because my mother, who was ill at the time, as a result of the awful stress of my sister being missing and then her body being discovered and having to be identified after it had been in this river for a while, she also died. She had a heart attack and died. So we had this terrible sort of double tragedy in the family. And my brother and I, our first responsibility really was to our father, who was stricken by this. It was the most awful thing for him to lose his wife and his daughter. And it took some time, really, for my brother and I to begin to think about it for ourselves. Now, for many, many years, I never talked about this thing that had happened. It seemed just too awful to mention to anybody else, until I realized that all of us experience grief and loss in our lives. And, so many people experience much, much worse. I mean, think about people in places of conflict and war, like Iraq or Afghanistan, who lose whole families. Think about people now in the COVID pandemic who are losing members of their families that they care about. Tens of thousands of them this year alone. It's an awful, awful tragedy. And so it came to seem to me to be important to share so that other people know that when we sympathize with loss, we really mean it, because we know. Anyway, to answer your question briefly, after that happened, and I had an opportunity to think about it a little bit and start to come to terms with it, the way I did it was by saying, these terrible things happen. These terrible blows occur to us. The shadows fall across our lives. And the way to respond to it is to try to do something in our world which compensates for it or mends it in some way. I mean, if something bad happens, do something better to try to make the world a better place.
I think you wrote that you just dove into your studies. You became something of a workaholic in order to find. So how can people find meaning in life if there's nothing above us?
Well, it is there. I mean, there is so much to be done in the way of our personal relationships, in the way of making our own lives genuinely good to live, genuinely worthwhile. And there are two important elements to that. One is that we know that at the very heart of good lives are good relationships. So, nurturing, tending your relationships better than you would tend your garden, for example, is a very important commitment. And the other thing is, we live in a world which is rich in cultural terms. I mean, there is so much to know, so much to learn, to read, to do, to discuss. One can get the most tremendous satisfaction out of being attentive to our world, so that in everything that we do, even our daily lives, our jobs, our contributions, but in our friendships and travels and family relationships, we can be a positive, we can be a contributor to the good of things. Here's one way of thinking about it, which kind of encapsulates it all. It is the case that the universe in some way came into existence, perhaps in a big bang, or perhaps a big bang is just one in a number of episodes in a multiverse, let's say. And then after billions of years, in one planet, in one galaxy, self-conscious, self-aware intelligence emerges. And perhaps it lasts for, a couple of million years maybe, or maybe we'll wipe ourselves out before that by being, too silly with nuclear weapons or something. But if in that tiny little moment in the entire universe's history, the sum of good outweighs the sum of bad, then the whole history of the universe has been justified. But if the sum of bad outweighs the sum of good, then it would be a very bad thing that there was a universe at all. So we have a kind of duty to try to add as much good as we can to the world for the universe's sake.
Wow, what a beautiful way of putting that. We're talking with Professor A.C. Grayling, a preeminent British philosopher and author. And after we come back from this break, I'm going to ask Professor Grayling, as he has talked about this before, what can philosophy teach us about dealing with the pandemic?
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Dustin, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I've only been an atheist for 3 or 4 years. I started being an atheist, I guess you could say, after a long period of existential angst that I felt in college. I don't know if I actually felt it. It could have just been more that I thought the brooding made me sexy and interesting, but I don't think that's actually the case. No, I'm actually an atheist because I've never actually heard a good argument for God, for his existence, or any God's existence. If I were to say there are unicorns in the world, you would go, okay, furnish the proof. So I put the same challenge out to theists out there, furnish the proof. I'm open, but I just haven't heard anything good yet.
Thank you for watching Freethought Matters. You can find more content by the Freedom from Religion Foundation at our website, ffrf.org. Follow FFRF on Facebook, and you'll get notifications about all of our content, including whenever we go live on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. FFRF is also on YouTube, where all of our programs, including this show and our weekly news bites, are available to watch anytime. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the web.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. I'm talking with Professor A.C. Grayling, preeminent philosopher and author, about how do we live our lives. So, Professor Grayling, I can call you Anthony, that is your name, Anthony. You have been on British media and you've been writing a lot about philosophy and the pandemic. I think I read an article or saw something on TV that you had mentioned how philosophy can inform us about how to deal with this global pandemic. What would you say?
Well, two things principally. One is to draw from the great resource of the Stoics in philosophy. The Stoics taught a very beautiful and rather noble outlook, which is this: that with respect to things that we can do nothing about, earthquakes and tsunamis and growing older and so forth, we must face them with courage. And with respect to things that we can do something about, our own appetites and fears and desires and the people near us whom we might be able to help, we should do whatever we can to achieve self-mastery and to make a contribution to others. And both those thoughts, the thought about the things that we can do nothing about and the things that we can do something about, are very valuable to us in this COVID time. Because here is this global pandemic, and until the vaccines have been rolled out, until we've controlled the spread of the pandemic, it represents a serious danger. And we must confront it with courage. But we can also do something to try to help. I mean, look at these wonderful scientists who've worked so fast and so well to try to find us remedies and preventatives for the pandemic. But our neighbors, our family members, people who are grieving as a result of losing people they care about to the pandemic, that is something that we can make a bit of a contribution to. And that's even if just in a small way, by acts of kindness or sympathy, by being concerned about people, and by being determined that our societies should be well prepared for this kind of contingency, because in an overcrowded world, I'm afraid it's all too likely to happen again.
Well, speaking about societies being prepared, I read, I think it was in the Londoner, a report that you had claimed, it was back in the summer, I think, that your government's response, the way it's handling the pandemic, amounts to criminal negligence, and that you said heads must roll. What do you mean by that?
Well, in the heads must roll aspect, I do, of course, mean it figuratively, because I'm not in favor of capital punishment. But on the first point, the criminal negligence point, I mean that quite literally and seriously. Our government here, which in many ways raises serious question marks, but in this particular connection, It was ill-prepared. It did not take action quickly enough. It delayed and delayed, even though the warning signs were stark. And then it began by trying to effect this herd immunity idea, that is, allowing the pandemic to spread through the population, in effect culling the people who would be vulnerable to it, and immunizing the people who would either get it or be resistant to it anyway. And their thinking along these lines was largely premised on the idea that closing down the shops and restaurants and pubs and travel and the like, hotels, would have a very serious effect on the economy, which indeed it has done all around the world. And so in the interests of the economy, they played with this idea of allowing people to fall ill. One of the worst aspects of it was that they instructed hospitals to return elderly people to care homes, even if they had the COVID virus, knowing already at that point that the COVID virus was much more dangerous to older people. And one result has been very high death rates in care homes and homes for elderly people. Now, all those things, well, each of them individually actually mounts up to something which is very culpable. Put them all together and you see something that really does deserve to be inquired into, and I think some remedial action taken.
Well, that doesn't look like herd immunity to me. That looks like thinning the herd. Just let them die off and let the dice roll the way they roll. So what's wrong with us? What's wrong with our species that we are unable to think rationally in times like this? It would seem like you could at least rationally make some cases that people would go, okay, let's do what we have to do. What's wrong with our brains or with our species that we're in this predicament?
Well, you know, one thing one has to notice about us, we human beings, is that we're not all, of one mind or one character. That humanity is an enormous congeries of minorities. So you might take your society or mine, and there will be whole areas of society that we would extremely happily be part of, because people there they're kind, they're rational, they think about people before they think about profit, they apply reason to our consideration of the world and how to live in it and so on. And then there are people who, for various reasons, and it may have to do with educational problems or social problems, poverty, the tremendous injustices that there are in society because there are such disparities between the rich and the poor. I mean, it is unthinkable when you consider it really that there are people sleeping on the street in our societies and other people living lives of conspicuous luxury. And this is just unjust. So in a very variegated situation like that, so diverse, you're going to get lots of different attitudes, pressures, people pulling in different directions. And unfortunately, in political orders, like yours in the United States and mine in the United Kingdom, which are very bipolar. That is, the two main political groupings, and they struggle with one another, get their hands on the levers of power and get their agenda through. And they're not behaving in the interests of the society as a whole, but in the interests of their supporters and of their own political fortune. So the result is that many, many, many people fall between the many different stools there are of competing interests and attitudes and desires.
So we have about 2 minutes here left, Anthony. It's obvious in my country that there's a lot of science denial going on, and maybe some of that's connected to religion. Do you see the same thing in the UK?
Oh, yes, very much so. And I think this is a global phenomenon. And one main reason for it is as follows. You can explain to anybody the major doctrines and tenets and demands of any religion in less than half an hour. But it takes a bit more than half an hour to understand physics and cosmology and chemistry and so on. And there is therefore a propensity on the great majority part to grab for the simple answer, the easy narrative, the closed box of explanations, and not to deal with the open-ended inquiries of science and its application via technology to our world.
You have a new book you're working on?
Yes, I just brought a book out this year called The Good State, which is on the principles of democracy, mainly addressing what's gone wrong that produced the Trump phenomenon and the Brexit phenomenon in my own country. And I have a new book coming out in next spring called The Frontiers of Knowledge, which actually addresses just the question you've been talking about. Why is it that people don't really understand science? Why is it that there's such a big gap between the scientific worldview and other worldviews? It's been a real delight to work on that one because it's full of interest.
Well, I think you agree with me that some scientists that we have read have been claiming that philosophy is dead. You know, philosophy was an ancient way of trying to answer unanswered questions, but now science has come along and we have answers and we don't need philosophy anymore. I'm certain you disagree with that in about 20 seconds.
Well, very, very quickly, some of my friends in the scientists are very skeptical indeed about what sometimes gets called continental philosophy. You know, this is Derrida and Foucault and people like that who are anti-science themselves and claim that science is just one among a number of alternative ways of thinking about the world. Serious philosophy is very conscious of the great value of science and its contributions and takes it very seriously. But you know, Dan, you and I have been talking philosophy this whole time, talking about our outlook on life, how to live it, what to think about difficult times such as the ones we're in at the moment. This is philosophy, and philosophy therefore is something that we always have to do afresh every time we meet the challenges that our world presents us with.
Well, thank you, Professor A.C. Grayling, for all your life's work.
Well, Dan, it's something I would like to reciprocate to you because I think you do a marvelous job.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters, because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.